So now that we've looked at the mobile context and which devices to support, let's examine fixed versus fluid layouts. So fluid emails adapt their layout to different device widths. As the browser widens and narrows, the layout will adjust, filling the available horizontal space. This is because the container width is set in relative values or percentages. In comparison, a fixed layout maintains its width irrelevant of the browser. If you set the width to be 400 wide, it's always going to be 400 wide. That's because the container width is defined in pixels rather than percentages. If you were to add a fixed width image into a fluid layout, it can cause problems. The 300 pixel wide fixed width image in this Net-a-Porter email, it's perfect on the iPhone but doesn't do as well on the smaller Nokia. Whereas the fluid image on the right scales to fit either device. Fluid layouts paired with fluid images are incredibly resilient. They can adapt to pretty much any width. Though if you had, say, a 1024 wide image and it's opened on the iPhone, the mobile browser will need to resize it down, which is obviously a performance drain. Ideally you want to serve an appropriately sized image to each device, shifting the burden from the mobile browser server side. When you are using a fluid layout, you often want to set a minimum or maximum width. This template's max width is 550. As you can see, it doesn't exceed that. Without the max width defined or supported, on a widescreen monitor, the lines of text can become hard to read, and the image expands well beyond its actual size. Unfortunately, there's no max width support in Outlook 07 and IE6. Big surprise. Which means that there's no way to cap how wide the layout will go. But, even without universal max width support, fluid layouts are still being used because of their accessibility. They definitely lend themselves to rich text layouts like this Good Experience newsletter. There's no reason not to use a fluid layout with a separate mobile version, as you already know that users are going to be on a small screen. ShopOrgs is a great example that was designed for BlackBerry users. Generally, I'd stick to a one-column fluid layout, otherwise lines of text can become too narrow. So let's look at fixed-width cross-platform layouts. Exactly how wide should they be? If you're targeting Android users, and most of us are, then I'd recommend sticking as close to 320 pixels as possible. I'll show you why. This JetBlue template is 580 pixels wide. When viewed on an Android, only the top left portion of the screen is visible by default. Unlike the iPhone, the Android doesn't scale content to fit the screen. And to make navigation even more difficult, the minimum and maximum zooms are extremely limited. Another reason that you might go skinny or fluid is that we can view email on a mobile device either via the browser or natively. When you do view via the browser, again we only see a small portion of the creative, that you can see here on the left. So if you did have a 320 pixel wide template, it would fit perfectly. But to be frank, the downside is the white space when viewed on the desktop. It certainly makes people nervous. If 320 pixels wide is just too skinny for you, try a layout between 480 and 520. The Android, Windows Phone 7 and BlackBerry all have popular devices that use a 480 res, so that would definitely be my second choice. Lastly, just bear in mind that if you are going to use a skinny layout, the iPhone scales to the widest container. So although the main content in this daily candy email is 480 pixels wide, the images to the side force it all to be zoomed out. Same with the Marshall's email. The pre-header table is wider than the content below, so it appears zoomed out, and it's hard to read some of this text. So besides skinny, another fixed width approach is maintaining traditional desktop widths, but increasing the size of the content. That way it's still legible when scaled down on a small screen. Whilst this may upset some Android users, it will allow you to keep using your existing templates. Though the wider the layout, the bigger everything will need to be, and you can end up straining users' eyes on the desktop. Also, you're sending large desktop assets to mobile users. When I looked at 50 retail emails, I found that 258K was the average weight of the images. To improve performance, ideally we'd send alternate images to mobile users. If you don't have that capability, there's still a lot that you can do to increase performance. The Mac email that I showed a few slides back is a great example. It's 700 pixels wide, image-based, but only 30K, as it's all text drawn just in a handful of colors. So going back to the problem of max width support, it turns out that we can bypass max width altogether by switching from a fixed layout on the desktop to a fluid layout on a mobile device using media queries. So just quickly, media queries allow you to serve up different CSS depending on the screen properties of a device, such as width or orientation. Campaign Monitor has some great posts if you want to read up on it. So if we wanted to go from a fixed to a fluid layout on the iPhone, we'd simply say, if the width is below 480 pixels, then switch the container from, in this case it was 640 pixels wide to 100%. It will probably be a lot easier if I just show you. So I designed this 3-part welcome series for Savvy Mum in collaboration with What Counts. You'll notice here that it's a fixed width layout as it doesn't extend to the edges of the screen. But when we resize the browser, it will switch to a fluid layout when it hits 480 pixels. So let me just show you that. So as you can see, here it's fixed. As soon as it hits 480 pixels about there, you can see the text all reformatting, and now it's fluid. Besides going from a fixed to a fluid layout, we're also hiding the hero image. So we're hiding this image here, the logo, and this recovery footer, as well as increasing the font sizes and the contrast and the line height, particularly the line height in the footer, which was a bit tricky. You can see there. In email 2 and 3, we're also replacing desktop images with mobile images. Let me quickly show you. This is email 2. And as soon as it hits 480 again, you can see they swap out. It was basically to reduce the amount of scrolling once it gets into a single column. And on email 3 as well, you can see you have this large desktop asset, which swaps out for the smaller mobile image. And we're also realigning these buttons, which are CSS3. One thing to keep in mind when you're going from a fixed to a fluid layout, you can see it more clearly on email 2, is if you have sort of paragraphs of text with multiple URLs in it, when you go into a fluid layout, the text is going to wrap, and you want to make sure that you don't end up with one URL sort of right on top of another, because people are using their fingers to tap links on mobile devices, and you don't want them to be too close together vertically. So just sort of pay attention to those kind of details. Something that is really important is when you do hide or swap desktop assets using media queries, whether it's an image or a container, they're still all downloaded by the mobile browser. They're just not visible. So it's downloading the desktop and the mobile assets. So, you definitely have to consider performance, when you're doing that. So as we just saw, media queries allow us to edit the layout, not the content. So if we had a line of text that said, "Click here to read my blog," we could change the font, the color, the size, but not the word in itself, because we can't edit the HTML, just the CSS. Support is a little spotty. I mean, while media queries work on iOS, they're not supported on Android if viewed via the Gmail app or in IE8 and below. Devices that don't support media queries will just render the desktop version, if that's your baseline. I don't mean to sound negative. Media queries are, they're already an everyday part of my job. It's just important to know the limitations. So moving on from media queries, this is an important fix for those of you linking to a separate mobile version. Safari on the iPhone uses a 980 pixel wide viewport. That means any template viewed on the web less than 980 pixels wide will appear zoomed out. So for instance, this template's 320, I think 320 pixels wide, and you think you're doing something mobile friendly. But when users click through, it's all zoomed out. To correct this, you need to define the viewport. These screenshots show how your mobile version looks by default on the left, with the viewport set to equal the device width, which in this case is 320 pixels. You only want to use this with fluid layouts, and finally with the viewport set to the width of your template. Now here's the line of code that you'll need, though there's some other parameters you can add, so it's worth doing some additional research. It's not necessary to define the viewport for email that's viewed natively. Even skinny emails, as they're automatically scaled to the width of the screen on the iPhone. It's only if you have a separate mobile version that's going to be viewed on the web. If there's just one slide that I wish I had years ago, it's this. I started designing mobile emails thinking I had 480 pixels in height on the iPhone when I was working with a 320 layout, only later realizing only 280 pixels is visible on the first screen. That number varies depending on the width of your template. We just looked at 320. This chart shows up to 700 pixels wide. You can see here. On the right is one of my test screens for a 600 pixel wide layout, and you can see that only 530 pixels in height is visible on the first screen. What I've found the most frustrating is trying to balance the navigation, branding and content when you have only 280 pixels to spare. While I hate to use Smash and Mag as an example, their content is 2 screens down. While the table of contents does have jump tags, you have to tap twice for them to work on the iPhone, and stacks of links this close together are just prone to mistaps. Here's a few good examples that elevate the content that users care about. You'll notice the longer the subject line, the less space is left on the first screen. Though for some companies the subject line is the primary content. With those earlier measurements in mind, I designed this 285 by, I think it was around 980 pixel wide horizontal layout. The from name's always visible up here when you scroll back and forth, so it acts as a stand-in logo. Another benefit is all the content sits above the fold on the desktop. One thing you'll notice is that all the URLs are on the same line, just along here. In this earlier version, they were arranged in a kind of W pattern, so you had URL, URL, URL. This is a screen from Device Anywhere. I'd not seen any problems when I was testing it. Though the instant I tried it out on a real device, I found it really annoying to have to keep moving my finger up and down, particularly because we scroll so fast. Plus, at that time, I was fairly new to touchscreens, and it made me really nervous to swipe over links. So I ended up moving all the URLs onto the same line. Now I really try and remember to design not just for fingers, but for newbie and lazy fingers. When designing this, I imagined an unpacked mobile app with each screen laid side by side. Each section is 320 pixels wide, so all the elements are in the right position and size for touch. With many smartphone browsers using WebKit, you can use CSS3 to reduce dependency on images. We even used it here to add some animation to the buttons. A core part of Windows Phone 7 is the horizontal scroll in panorama view. Gartner predicted that in 2015 Microsoft's Windows platform will secure second place behind Android, I think with around 19% or something, due to its alliance with Nokia. So, you never know, horizontal scrolling may gain some traction in the next few years. They even support two-way scrolling. Something to keep in mind when designing horizontal layouts. This ANF email is 2,415 pixels wide. If we were to scale it to the width of the iPhone, you'd end up with a small strip along the top and all of this dead space underneath. So to avoid this, it scales to the height instead. I tried setting the viewport to see if I could force it to sort of zoom in on this front section. But as you saw earlier, it just doesn't budge. Though here on the right, it works fine in the web browser. Because it scales to the height rather than the width, you want to use as few lines of footer text as possible. Otherwise, your content will appear zoomed out. So you can see the difference. When I took all this footer text out, this is a lot easier to read. So here are some takeaways. So thanks very much for your time, and I sincerely hope it's been useful. Feel free to drop me an email at anna@stylecampaign if you have any questions. Cheers, everyone.